Tonight we're talking about, in Rethinking the Church, rethinking structure. Rethinking structure. And so the obvious question is, what is structure? What is the definition? Because a lot of times different people have different definitions of the term structure. So what we're talking about in this study is the functioning, the practical functioning of the body of Christ in the local church. So it would be likened to the skeletal system of the body, if you will. How the skeletal system actually serves to hold together and to keep all of the parts working as they should in tandem for the whole body. And so in a church, structure is the same. It's what holds the bones, the processes, the administration of the church together. And the result is that the church structure can either serve the church well or it can bring it to a standstill. And there are different levels of structure. There are the structure that a church has can greatly energize the people, or it can bring them down and discourage them and hurt them. So what we have to keep in mind is that for structure to be ideal, it should equip men and women to use the gifts that God has given them to serve Him through the church, rather than tie the hands of people who are called to serve and frustrate them, those who are the most dedicated and loyal of the servants within the church. So the structure of any organization directly affects three things. You can move forward there, Austin. These areas, more than any, I think, are affected, and White does a good job of expounding upon this. But they are morale, effectiveness, and unity. So we'll talk about each of those briefly. Within the topic of morale, this is the area of the church that really is seen by the world, where people know if good things are happening in a church or if things are pretty lousy in a church. And so factors that play a role in negative morale, White has demonstrated or described as the following. The first one, he's calling these demotivators. Demotivators which impact morale. The first one is politics. So, politics. This can be seen on different levels. Politics in the secular world really have no place in the church. There are issues with which we may agree or disagree with politicians or political parties, but taking political sides and becoming political in church actually demotivates people and hinders morale. As people who believe in the sanctity of human life, generally Christians oppose abortion or euthanasia or any kind of mercy killing, but to hold a rally for a political candidate who supports your view goes over the line. The IRS thinks so too. But there's also another kind of politics within the church, and that is the politics that different groups or individuals within the church engage with. You have people who are taking sides, people who are plotting, people who are planning, who are leaving others out, or who are trying to do this and do that, and they're working behind the scenes. Oftentimes, the work in a meeting that's done is very minimal compared to the work that's done by some of those in the meeting when they go to the parking lot. Okay? I mean, that happens in all churches. People get in little groups, and then they make decisions, and then they go and politic. Well, White says this is a demotivating factor for morale. Besides politics, he mentions unnecessary rules. Most of the time, rules are made in response to something that made someone angry. Rules are made as a reaction to something someone didn't like. Oftentimes, not always, and we have to have rules to live by, and that goes for churches too. But unnecessary rules that limit people and that target people, can be demotivating factors and actually cause harm to those people. Another that he defines is poorly designed work. Poorly designed work. You know, to me, this the first thing that comes to my mind is a worship service. You know, I know pastors that have told me, you know, well, we don't really plan anything. We just go in there, and whatever people want to sing, we sing, and whatever you know the Lord gives me, I'll preach on it at the moment. And you know, I found that the Lord doesn't usually work that way with me. He usually prepares me over a period of time. And so, you know, if you go back, the example of the Old Testament, and the Old Testament of the Hebrew children was that they had spontaneous moments of worship, but it always came because they had planned, structured worship. So, and any other area within the work, within the church, any area of work within the church where we don't put much effort into it, we can actually find people become discouraged. The next one White describes is unproductive meetings. How many of you have ever served on a committee? And none of you have ever attended an unproductive meeting, I'm guessing. Yes, the meetings that we have should be for a purpose and not for the sake of having a meeting. And we have to be careful that we don't live to meet, but that we meet to serve and to live our faith, to plan, to promote, to move. The next one he mentions is internal competition. You know, this is where you have a group of people who are always against another group of people in the church, or an individual who's always against another individual, or a class that's always against another class, or a class that wants to become a church of its own, basically. You don't need the rest of the church. You just need our class. We need small groups. We need good relationships within those. But we need each other as a whole as well. It can also happen with staff. In many churches, you have a staff where there's competition for people's attention, people's loyalty. And that's not good. The next one he mentions is discouraging responses to new ideas. Anybody ever experienced that? You had an idea, you thought it was a great one, maybe the Lord gave it to you, and then whoever you shared it with just poured water all over it? Yeah. I mean, it happens to all of us in many areas of life, but it certainly happens in churches. The next one he mentions is inadequate use of potential. We have a lot of people who have gifts, talents, and they don't know how to use them in the church. We had a gentleman in a church that I pastored in Raleigh who had a stroke. He was 52, my age. He actually had a stroke and stayed on life support for some time, and then he died. And at his funeral, his wife, before the funeral actually, she brought me a CD and said, "I want you to play this at the funeral." I said, it's Andy and some of his guitar work. And it turned out that Andy was a master on the classical guitar. And he played the most beautiful, beautiful tunes. And it just occurred to me, I never heard Andy play the guitar in church. I never heard Andy play the guitar in any ministry setting. He wasn't playing anything wrong or bad in the recordings, but this man was a rare and extreme talent whose gifts could have been used within the service of the Lord, and he was never given the opportunity. His potential was not fulfilled in service to the Lord in that area. Inadequate use of potential. And the next one White mentions is over control. And this is one that many of us struggle with. We want to be in control. We want to control the schedule. We want to control the budget. We want to fix and control people. We want to help, but we have to respect boundaries. And the same is true when it comes to control of things in the church, whether it's a classroom or an idea, a ministry idea. Sometimes we need to share the opportunity to lead, or to serve, to bear burdens, whatever the case may be. So these are all areas that affect morale. The second thing that he mentions is effectiveness. Morale, then effectiveness. And it's directly affected by structure. White says that structure works in an organization like grease to a wheel. It enables the working parts to move smoothly and efficiently. None of us wants our church to be ineffective at our mission. Our mission is very simple. Christ said is to go into all the world and make disciples. Our mission is to reach the lost and to make disciples of those who come to Christ. We have to think in terms of the effectiveness of what we're doing. This is directly affected by the structure of the church. And the third thing he mentions is unity. Unity is linked to structure. Think of companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, all the really big tech companies. These companies made millionaires, even billionaires, out of their employees, hundreds of them. Not billionaires, but some billionaires, but hundreds of millionaires out of their employees. And the question is, why is it that people who become so wealthy working for a company like Google or Apple or Microsoft would continue to work for that company after they are wealthy enough they don't have to work anymore. They're treated well. They are treated as respected employees. They say, these are some of the things they say. The sense of community they have at work. Sense of community. And a lot of that they attribute to the simple structure of the company. The simple structure. They don't have rules about what they wear, for instance. But we do, don't we? We don't have them written down, maybe, and published, but we make them known to people if they break them. Here's what Bill Gates had to say about Microsoft and why people stay there. He said, individuals generate ideas, and Microsoft makes it possible for those ideas to become reality. He said, our strategy has always been to hire strong, creative employees and delegate responsibility and resources to them so they can get the job done. And the result, he says, is a unity that even keeps millionaires around. So, all of this being said about structure and what it does to a church, what it's there for, let's consider the current structure of most churches in America today. We know that morale, effectiveness, and unity are key issues for the life of a church. So structure has to be evaluated in light of whether it promotes morale, effectiveness, and unity. Most forms of church government have three features that dominate the structure of the church. And these three features are, first of all, committees. Committees. Most committees, according to White, do not actually engage in ministry. Rather, they are responsible for the oversight and administration of a ministry. They make decisions that others implement or attempt to reach conclusions on issues that are then brought before the wider church for approval. And White says the idea is that a small group of people provide oversight for the entire church. Committees. The second area of structure is policies. Policies. Policies are the written guidelines, the written rules that are intended to govern the decision-making of any organization, and that's the case in churches as well. Again, policies are usually designed in reaction to something that's happened, as a result of something that's taken place. One church that I know of had a recent split. And part of the split was over a decision that the church made. And when they went to vote on the next step, a lot of the people who had left came back to vote because they were still members. And so, in response to that, a new guideline was drawn up that if you didn't attend every Sunday, you didn't vote. And so, this policy now excludes those people who left. That's an example of policies being written in response to actions that have already taken place. The next part of structure in today's church is typically majority rule. And that's whether it's in the form of a business meeting, it can be a quarterly business meeting, a monthly business meeting, whatever the case may be. And it could be more about how a committee or board makes a final decision. Maybe you have an oversight board within the church that makes those decisions, if not the whole church or a committee. But in each of these, the rule is generally majority rules. It's a democracy. Now, White says that we should at the very least rethink structure. And so, you can go forward there, Austin. Even though committees, policies, and majority rule are deeply entrenched within the life of the church, White says, it is interesting to note that none of the terms, committees, policies, majority rule, can be found in the Bible. So that hits home when we recognize that these are concepts, practices, traditions, whatever you want to call them, that churches embrace, and they're not in the Bible. Now, George Barna, in his research, has discovered that the most successful churches subscribe to a singular philosophy. And that is this: the ministry is not called to fit the church's structure, but the structure exists to further effective ministry. The ministry is not called to fit the church's structure, but the structure exists to further effective ministry. Now, in rethinking structure, here are some things that White offers. First of all, he has some concerns about committees. He says there are two main concerns regarding committees and boards. First, committees take people away from the front lines of ministry and move them into issues related to maintenance, such as budgets and organizational matters. Now, Rick Warren is a highly successful pastor of the huge Saddleback Church out in California. And here's what he has to say. And it's really telling. He says, most churches take their brightest and best people and turn them into bureaucrats. Bill Hall says this: it's like a football game where the first string players are not on the field, but are rather taking tickets and selling programs, walking the aisles and working the refreshment booths and counting the gate receipts. The result is that people become separated from the ministry of the church. They become involved in the work of the church, or not in the work of the church, but in church work. The work of the church is ministry, but church work is administration. Rick Warren also says that the difference between a committee and a ministry is profound. Committees discuss it, ministries do it. Committees argue, ministries act. Committees maintain, ministries minister. Committees talk and consider. Ministries serve and care. Committees discuss needs. Ministries meet needs. Second concern that White has is that committees keep the people who are doing the ministry from making the decisions about the ministry. The individuals who are most intimately involved in a particular ministry, he says, are the best qualified to make the day in and day out decisions regarding that ministry. And we all know that there have to be checks and balances. There has to be some oversight. There has to be a pragmatic side of us. But we also know that there's a lot of truth in that statement. The people who are most involved in the ministry are the ones who have the intimate knowledge to move forward in that ministry. So these are the concerns White has with committees. And then he talks about the problem with policies. He says a policy governs decisions and directs procedure independent of a situation. He says that the one indispensable ingredient for the success of any human endeavor is the use of judgment. But policies are inherently limited because they can never be enough rules to cover every conceivable circumstance. And a second policy, White says, second problem with policies is that they can become an end unto themselves. And so rather than the policies serving the organization begins to serve the policies. It's why it exists all of a sudden. Committees, policies, and then he has misgivings about majority rule. Understand that I'm not suggesting that these are all things that our church must jettison. What I am suggesting is that there are other ways to think about some of the things we do, that maybe there's a better way for some of the things we're doing, and we'll come to that in just a moment. Misgivings about majority rule. The first misgiving is how excess of consensus or overenthusiasm for democratic principles can render an organization impotent in terms of actually doing anything. That's from a Yale study about all kinds of organizations. And what that means is that sometimes there's a small group of people that has a good idea, or a person who has a good idea, but the idea that, because we are a democratic organization, and many times because I didn't come up with that idea, I'm not going to support it. Or I wasn't included in the development of that idea. And so that over-enthusiasm about, all we got to do is get enough votes, it goes back to the politicking. The politics we talked about in the first slide. He says the second misgiving about majority rule, one far more serious, is that the Bible teaches that the church is a family. Think about your own family. In most families, there are more immature members than there are mature. Perhaps more children than there are adults. You say, somebody's got to be the adult. Somebody has to make the hard choices. What if majority ruled in our homes? Would we be eating ice cream for dinner every night? Would we live at Disney World? Stay up all night, no bedtime. You're right. School? Who wants to go to school? Amen. Yeah. Mine did too. So this is exactly what happened to the Israelites. Moses sent the spies to check out the promised land. And they came back and to report whether or not it was everything God had said it was going to be. And of the 12 spies, they all agreed it was a beautiful place, a land flowing with milk and honey. But the majority, 10 of the 12, said, we can't handle that. We can't take it. It's beyond our ability. But 2, Caleb and Joshua, said, it's not bigger than God. God wants us to have it. We got to take it. We got to be obedient. God has called us to go there. We have to obey Him. It doesn't look humanly possible. It doesn't make sense when we draw it on a board. But we've got to be obedient. Now, what if Moses had gone with the majority? The Israelites would have never entered the promised land. And so, where does that bring us? And this is, the rethinking part. A new wineskin. Jesus talked about a new wineskin. He said, no one puts a piece of clothing, unshrunk clothing, on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment, and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine in old wineskins, or else the wineskins break. The wine is spilled. The wineskins are ruined. They put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. There are a lot of different structures that can build morale, that can increase effectiveness, that can stimulate unity. The Bible gives us a lot of freedom in this area of how to go forward, only requiring us that a church organize for effectiveness in reaching its purposes and mission. There are two concepts that White argues deserve serious attention and investigation for any church that's rethinking its structure. And the first one is separating maintenance from ministry. Separating maintenance from ministry. He says, in most churches, the relationship between maintenance and ministry is simple. The pastors are the ministers, and the people are the administrators. The pastors are the ministers, and the people are the administrators. He says, lay people see their primary leadership role as that of running the church. He says, yet this is diametrically opposed to the teaching of the Bible in relation to the pastor's role as equiper and leader. And it creates a bottleneck for ministry. Rethinking structure involves an entirely new paradigm, he says. The people are the ministers, the pastors are the administrators. Here's what Rick Warren has written. Maintenance is church work, budgets, buildings, organizational matters, and so forth. Ministry is the work of the church. White says that effective churches believe the role of God's people is to minister to the world every day of the week, living out their spiritual gifts instead of running the church by sitting on committees and making decisions about what others can and cannot do. As a result, churches must decide whether they want to structure themselves for control or growth. Because White suggests that only this new paradigm works if we want to structure ourselves for growth. He says rethinking will demand structuring for growth, which means high morale, effectiveness, and unity. For this to happen, both the pastor and the people will have to give up control. The pastor must give up control of the leadership, and the people must give up control of the leadership. The pastor must give up control of the ministry. Pretty harsh words. The second part of this new wineskin, this new paradigm, is self-directed teams. He says teams are effective or indispensable rather, at effective ministry, and can be found throughout the Bible, from Nehemiah's strategy for rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem to the purposeful team building of Jesus with his disciples. Now, any of us who is honest knows that teams can outperform individuals. Okay? We can do much more as a team than any one of us can do on our own. Exactly. Exactly. We have to imagine that God wants us all on the same team, working together, and not as individuals. For a team to function, there has to be self-direction, which means they have to own the process, own the task at hand. You know, it's kind of like I like the term manager for baseball coaches, because that's what they do. They train, they prepare, they equip their players. But once the game starts, they manage. It's the players who have the direct responsibility to reach their goal. The manager can offer advice, he can give them insight, but he's through coaching once the game starts. At least for that game. The people have to give up control and instead be willing to serve as part of a team. And only when given the responsibility and the authority to follow through on a task they've been given can a team have the ability to become flexible and responsive to changing events and demands. Because the situations of our world are not static. The needs of the people around us are not static. They're always changing. And we have to be willing to adapt to those needs. That's the whole idea of the new wineskin. The questions that White raises at the end of this chapter are: is your church's structure preventing something from taking place, such as growth, effectiveness, unity? Few areas, he says, of church life are as important to rethink as structure. But rethinking structure of a church may just keep the church from dying. Now, that's a lot of heavy information when we consider traditional churches, which I would say we are.